Do you know what the best thing is about projects like this one? Okay, time to uncover the next beam. It's the moment when things start to come together. When all the planning and the research and the dismantling turns around and becomes real progress. For so long now, we've been ripping things up, making tough decisions, and deliberating between options. And now we get to just do things. And the biggest thing we're doing right now is making deck beams.
Today, beam production has to start. I have made a drawing. The drawing shows that we are replacing about 50% of the short beams, and then we're also doing a few full beams.
It's a lot of work, but at the end, we're gonna have a beautiful and seaworthy vessel to sail the world in, and we figure that's worth it. Come be part of the story as we make deck beams and inch ever closer towards that dream.
So enough of that. Let's go make cuts.
Let the beam project commence. In the last episode, we made our first ever deck beam, and after that success, it's now time to ramp up production. The Magic Carpet Workshop is about to be a whirlwind of activity, but the very first step in all of this is to get the old beams out of the way, and that begins with removing the carriage bolts which hold them in place. 2 big bronze carriage bolts run through each beam, attaching them firmly to the beam shelf. They're very tricky to remove, so in our first experimentations, we just cut them with a multi-tool and figured we'd replace them. But when we realized that these bolts cost $10 a piece, we changed tactics.
Alright, I've exposed the heads of the carriage bolts, and now I'm going to dig deeper so that I can grip the shank with a vice grip.
This beam was only rotten on the bottom, which actually made it a bit harder to get the carriage bolts out. Some of the other severely rotten beams just fall away around the bolt, which definitely makes our job easier. Awesome.
Now that the bolts are off, I am making a cut with the fine. This one's super nice. This one. They have a bunch of nails going into them in different directions, so they really grip. So you have to kind of chip them away in parts, and then you have this beam in multiple layers and different chunks. So now pretty much it's the screw holding the end grain here, so I'll get it off. End grain never holds too well, so just on one side and the other. first half. Here we go.
Hard work, but we repeated this process on every second beam. Of course, the deck still needs to be supported, so we can't remove all of them at once.
Ta-da! A thing of beauty. Not quite. And next is the fine with the carbide blade, and we'll cut these off and the screws in the notch here and clean it all up to start inserting the new beams.
With the old beams cut away, it's time to start production of some new ones. This is the fun and satisfying part.
So this one is the bottom. I think it's the nicest looking. These just this side, and these on both sides.
Okay.
And we do it together at the same time. Okay, so you just start on one end, but do the other end. But do 3 and 3 or 4 and 4.
This is the satisfying part, gluing the pieces of yellow cedar together and then later clamping them down on our jig to create a new beam. And boy oh boy does it feel good to be moving past destruction stage and moving into reconstruction phase. We're finally creating new stuff rather than destroying old stuff, and the excitement has been running high in the boatyard lately.
Should we do half and half not to get in the way?
Sure. And just like that, a new deck beam was born. All we had to do now was leave it to dry on the jig overnight, and the next morning we'd be able to put it into use. Okay, time to uncover the next beam.
Exactly.
So this is the second full beam that we've laminated, which means that in total, we've laminated enough beams for 8 half beams. Here's the 4 half beams that we made from the other beam, and this one will make another 4.
Exactly.
This 8-foot laminated beam was now ready to be cut into 4 short beams to fit under the side decks. But before making the cuts, we had to take very precise measurements.
So I already have 3 methods of doing this. Basically I changed to this one using a template beam, since I made a few that have the same curvature as our original beams. And as you've seen, I can just trace where the bulwarks are, what curvature on top and on the sides. So now when I go down to my compound miter, I can just cut this exactly on the line, and then I know what cut I have to do on the original one. And the same with this one. This one is very close already because I've used the template to make the prior one, and they don't change by a lot. The handy part about this template beam is that I made it shorter on purpose, because the conflict is when you have a full length one, then it is very difficult to handle from inside and from outside. The only last measurement I need is the full length, since this one is not. And it seems like a little inaccurate doing it with this tape measure, but in fact it doesn't have to be too accurate, as to get it inside it has to be a little short, otherwise I couldn't get it in. So it has to be a little shorter, so I have 5 millimeters to play with. So I just place this one here about 22.5 inches. And now I go down, I know the full length, and I know at this end what angles I need, and at this end. So now that I have transferred the angle that I have to cut on the compound miter, I am going to cut the real deal. And now I'm adding this cut here. So now that the angle is dialed in, I make sure I have my real beam on the saw in the same orientation that has tricked me before. That of course you cannot place it on this way if this is the Carlin end and now it's on this side. Of course it has to be the same way. And that's where I feel that with the template beam it really indicates all this very nicely. Instead, if I have just all the angles on a piece of paper, it's easier to get confused, even if you label everything correctly. And good thing, again, is we have a lot of wiggle room, so I can always come down and correct it. Now that the cuts are made, I still have very sharp edges, and edges, they can just snag on things. I can break little chips off as I'm trying to test fit it. And for that, it's time for some Swiss precision. My trusted hometown sandpaper. And I'm choosing 150 because 120 would just leave too big gouges, because otherwise Maya will grumble if I use 120 and then she would have to go over it with 180 or 150.
Yes.
So I go right away with 150.
Excellent.
I really feel like every workshop should have rolls of sandpaper. Of course, I could have also have this in sheets, but the sheets that I have, I prefer to keep them for sheet sanders, or when I divide it up and I put it on a bigger block to really, when you have to do precision work. But instead now, I need a really tiny piece. I can come grab this off the roll. Really handy.
I've never met someone in my life as passionate about sandpaper as you are.
I'm passionate about sandpaper because it is what produces the finish, and I am a fan of finish too. Mm-hmm. It's like everybody thinks I am in love with vacuuming. No, it's because I like tidy. So therefore vacuums are my friends. And sandpaper, I believe that sanding is a chore. I have found so myself when I don't have the right tools. When you do have the right tools, I find sanding can be a joy, but it can as much become a nightmare if you don't have a good sandpaper or a good machine.
Yeah,
so
that's
of course
so true.
It's the components.
Cool.
It's not just about the grit, it's about what material it is on the sandpaper, It's about what application methods they have to get it evenly on it. It's about the backing paper. It seems like very silly, but it's also about the material that it is on. Other paper crinkles. Once it has crinkled, it cracks open. It's pretty much useless. This is very fine, but it's very tough. Yeah, there's so much to everything always. All right, let's go. And now it is touching the hull over there, but it is not driven into the notch here. So that is why we need to make them a bit shorter, because otherwise we couldn't even get them in here.
And the point of this is driving it that way into the carlin, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is the gap that we'll have to live with, but it will be filled. You want to have it perfectly fitting in the carlin, and here we'll get 2 carriage bolts.
Because actually the original beams, if you have a look here, they've got this gap, of course, as well, which actually surprised us at the beginning, but now makes sense. Like, this is actually a pretty sizable one over here.
Carriage bolts still hold it.
Yeah, the bolts hold it, and then with an extra epoxy or wedge or whatever. Our deck beam fit, but of course the job is far from over. So the next step is to put a clear coat of epoxy on the beams before we do the final installation. And this is just to protect the beams against moisture damage and make them a little bit more stable over the long term. We are setting up this little corner of the workshop, this shelf, to be our epoxy cavern.
So what was the length we cut? It's the other way around. Oh no, this way around? Yeah, this works.
I haven't been playing much music lately. The boat refit and the video production have taken center stage. But with everything coming together so nicely, I felt inspired again to go somewhere beautiful and record some tunes. So here's a song to accompany the construction of our epoxy cave. I hope you enjoy. The beams were ready, our production line was in full swing, I felt artistically fulfilled, and the workshop was alive with work. This beam production job is going to carry on for several weeks, perhaps even over a month. We have a lot to do, but we're happy to do it. life is good.